All right, this is Mr. Peterson with the first screencast for Unit 8 in AP Environmental Science. Today, we're getting into environmental hazards that we as humans face. In later chapters, we'll get into more specifics of each kind of hazard as they affect the air, water, and soil that we need to sustain our lives. So the first idea in your notes is risk. Risk is the probability that you will suffer harm from some kind of hazard. That harm can come in many forms, ranging across simple injuries, disease, death, or economic loss. Risks are expressed in percentages, like saying that there is a 1 in 100 chance of something happening, like developing a form of cancer. And that's something that makes it hard to understand. You may know 200 people, and if there's a 1 in 100 chance of people developing this form of cancer, you'd expect that 2 of your friends would develop that cancer sometime during their lives. And if 10 of them had this form of cancer, it would make the newspaper, there would be petitions for environmental cleanup, etc., etc. Well, because surely something extra weird is going on, right? Wrong. There's an idea in statistics called the law of large numbers, and it means that these kinds of probabilities only work out with very large sample sizes. To illustrate it, imagine flipping a coin 10 times. The probability of getting a heads is 1 out of 2, or 50%. So you'd expect, on average, to get 5 heads out of 10 flips. But would you call the Guinness Book of World Records if you got 8 heads out of 10 flips? Probably not. Get 800 heads out of 1,000 flips, and now you're on to something weird. These probabilities only work out at very large sample sizes, but that makes it hard to wrap your head around when you're trying to figure out what they really mean. Now, moving on. Risk assessment is a process determining the probability of a particular risk, along with the damage that's likely to occur with it. Risk management is the decision process of figuring out how serious the risk is and whether it should be reduced, and if so, how far, or how much, or how. For an example, there used to be cars that didn't have seatbelts. That means that when cars rolled off the assembly line, it didn't have seatbelts installed. They were added on as aftermarket modifications. That's because in the mid-1960s, the U.S. government assessed the risk people were facing from car accidents and decided to manage the risk by putting into law that all cars manufactured after that point would have seatbelts installed at the factory. It started with lap belts only, then moved to shoulder belts later, as the process of risk assessment and management worked to reduce the risk of harm from car accidents to an acceptable level. Now, it would reduce the risk of a car accident even more if we went to 5-point seatbelts, like race car drivers wear, but most of us would find that to be too much of a burden for too little gain. Plus, lots of people would stop wearing them because of the difficulty of putting them on, making the risk of car accidents actually grow. But you still see small infants tucked into a 5-point harness until they reach a certain age because it's worth it for them. Now, we as humans face many kinds of hazards in the environment. First up, we'll talk about biological hazards, like these malaria, that have finished reproducing inside of 2 red blood cells and will break free to infect more red blood cells. Biological hazards are pathogens that it can infect a host and cause disease. Malaria is a parasite, but many types of bacteria, viruses, protists, and fungi also fit this category of hazard. Next up is chemical hazard. Like mercury, chemical hazards come in many forms that we'll get into later, but for now, they're just chemicals in air, water, soil, or food that cause harm when we breathe them, drink them, absorb them, or eat food that contains them. Physical hazards are things that we face from the forces of the world around us. This is a picture of lava flow from a volcano, and has flowed across a person's driveway, and if it gets about 10 feet closer to the house will start to burn. Physical hazards include wildfire, earthquakes, volcanoes, floods, violent storms, landslides, and pretty much anything else the earth can throw our way. And next we have cultural hazards. They're things like unsafe working conditions, like this guy on the ladder, but they also include things like the risk of crime and poverty. Don't ever stand on a ladder like this guy's doing. Cultural hazards are risks we face as a part of human culture, but they're usually outside the control of one person. For the guy on the ladder, you might say that he's in charge of what he's doing, but if this is the only ladder his boss provided him and the job has to be done, then it's definitely a cultural hazard. Now, there's a similar hazards that come up next. They're called lifestyle hazards. Lifestyle hazards are also part of the human culture, but they are more under one's direct control. Smoking is a hazard that falls under the lifestyle choice category because you either decide to smoke or you decide not to. Nobody's forcing you, but there is a choice. Please make the right one. To illustrate the difference between secondhand smoke would fall back into the cultural hazard because it's the outside of control of any one person. Back when I was your age, almost every gas station you go to reeked of cigarette smoke, and the same could be said of most restaurants and lots of businesses. Now, it's rare to walk into a public building of any kind and smell cigarette smoke because it's been banned outright. Now, we did this because we all got together and, as a society, decided to manage the risk of secondhand smoke by not allowing smoking inside public buildings. But that's a cultural risk. It's a lifestyle risk when someone smokes inside their own home. I hope that clears up the smoke on that issue. Now, next up in your notes is some more specifics of biological hazards. First up is non-transmissible diseases. Heart disease, asthma, diabetes, and cancer are all examples of non-transmissible diseases. Most of the time, non-transmissible diseases are caused by something other than a virus, bacteria, or fungus. So, in a complex set of terms, most non-transmissible diseases are non-infectious. There are a few exceptions, like Lyme disease, which is caused by an infectious bacteria. If you get bitten by a tick, the tick can spread the bacteria to your blood and cause you to become ill with Lyme disease. However, it's still non-transmissible because you can't give Lyme disease to another person directly. No matter what the cause of the disease is, non-transmissible disease cannot be transferred from one person to another. As human society has increased medical care and research to the point where we extend our life expectancy by reducing risks for many of the other hazards, many of these non-transmissible diseases end up being our cause of death because they're harder to stop through simple means like washing your hands, wearing masks, and avoiding contact with others. Transmissible diseases are up next, and these are caused by pathogens like bacteria, viruses, and parasites that infect a host and cause diseases. They're transmissible because if a person can then transfer the pathogen to a new host and infect them, again, non-transmissible diseases can sometimes be caused by pathogens, but they can't be transmitted from person to person. Transmissible diseases are also referred to as being infectious, contagious, or communicable. This drawing is of a flu virus particle approaching the cilia of some lung cells. If it infects those cells and reproduces later on, when that person coughs or sneezes, new virus particles can be ejected and spread through the air to a new host. There's a joke in here. Oh yeah. A virus walks into a bar. The bartender says, "Hey, we don't serve viruses here." The virus says, "Well, you're not a very good host." Now let's get serious. Infectious diseases can be a relatively minor risk, or they can be major risks to our lives. Infectious diseases are called epidemics when they affect a large number of individuals, but they're confined to one particular region of the world, usually inside of one country. They're called pandemics when an epidemic grows to a global scale. This picture is from the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, which infected about 500 million people worldwide and killed around 50 million of them. That means if you got the flu that year, you had a 10% chance of dying. Seriously. Now, if you've ever had the real honest flu, you know that it can make you feel like you're dying, but the regular average flu is nothing like the version that went around in 1918. It killed about 2% of the world's population that year, which means it's pretty heavy hitter as infectious transmissible diseases go. People still die of the flu in modern times, but they're usually very old, very young, or have already compromised immune systems. Researchers are always monitoring the various strains of the flu that are circulating in the world, always watching for signs that a strain like the 1918 Spanish flu might be on its way back, so that appropriate prevention actions like mass vaccination campaigns can be undertaken. Now, the risk of infectious disease can be reduced by vaccinations, improving nutrition. Remember, those compromised immune system people, their immune system might work better with proper nutrition. Then there's the ridiculously simple stuff like education and proper hygiene techniques, like distributing these masks the police are wearing in 1918, or the one from the previous slide, to things as simple as elementary schools sending home letters and during an outbreak of Shigella. Shigella is the scientific name for the bacteria that causes dysentery, which causes one of the fatal forms of diarrhea. There was an outbreak of it in the elementary school here in 2012, but it started to go away as soon as parents and teachers started harping on the importance of washing your hands after using the bathroom. Why? Because that's how Shigella spreads. I know, yuck, right? For diseases transmitted by mosquitoes, you can cut the risk of infection by distributing mosquito nets for people to sleep under. Now, on your notes outline, I need you to read the specific information in your book on influenza, HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. There are 4 classic examples of infectious diseases that you need to be aware of, but I'm leaving that part for you to read on your own. Find out how each one is transmitted, general information on how it affects a person, and then some of the ways to prevent it. We actually, in Colquitt County High School, the entire county closed schools because of a flu issue. They took 3 extra days before spring break off so that they could try to clean all the schools because there were so many people missing school due to the flu. And even this year, which is 2018, we had the same issue where we almost canceled school because so many people were out for the flu. It helps prevent the spread by allowing those that are sick to heal before coming into a classroom and spreading it to more people. And now back to chemical hazards. Chemical hazards are those caused by toxic chemicals, which are any chemicals that can cause temporary or permanent harm or death to humans. The 5 worst offenders are arsenic, lead, mercury, vinyl chloride, and PCBs. I put this picture in here because before there was unleaded gas, there was leaded gas, which contained, lead. Adding it to gas prevented engine wear and kept gas engines from knocking, which is a problem resulting from the gas igniting at the wrong point in an engine cycle. It can be completely inconsequential, but it can also get so bad that it destroys the entire engine. Adding lead to gas prevented the problem entirely. The problem was lead causes birth defects, brain damage, and so burning it and having it enter the atmosphere for everyone to breathe really isn't very smart. Literally, brain damage isn't good. Now, there are 3 broad classes of toxic chemicals, and the first ones are carcinogens. Carcinogens are chemicals and some kinds of radiation, which isn't really a chemical, but there's no place to put it, and some viruses that cause or promote cancer. Cancer is simply regular cells in a person's body that have lost the ability to control their own cell division. So they grow uncontrolled into a mass of cells called a tumor. The tumor disrupts normal body functions, which can have a wide range of effects depending on which tissue and organs are affected. Now, carcinogens either cause or promote cancer, simply by damaging cells to the point that they become cancerous. The picture is of an X-ray dose badge, which people who work around X-ray machines in the hospital and sometimes the dentist's office wear. The little circle in the badge is made of material that measures how much X-ray exposure they've had. Because short-term exposure to diagnose a broken nose or a cavity is a net positive for you. But long-term exposure to X-rays is bad because each dose of radiation causes very small amounts of damage, which over long periods of time can lead cells to lose control of themselves. That's why when the X-ray technician positions you under the machine and says hold still, they walk out of the room to press the button to take the X-ray. They're shielded from the X-rays by material on the wall, but the badge is back up to make sure they're using proper techniques and that the wall hasn't been damaged and is exposing everyone to X-rays. Sometimes the parts of you that don't need an X-ray get covered up with a heavy apron made of lead, which blocks X-rays. That's all part of the risk management side of things. X-rays are good for medical purposes, but they have to be managed to prevent unnecessary harm. The next category of chemical hazards is called mutagens. And there are any substance that causes mutations to DNA. So, they can be chemicals or forms of radiation, but they're different from carcinogens because they specifically cause DNA mutations. These mutations might impair your health directly, or they may end up causing a cell to develop into cancer. But they cause cancer by causing mutations, which makes them a different set of hazards than carcinogens. The last set of toxic chemicals are called teratogens. Any chemicals that cause harm or birth defects to a developing embryo or fetus is called a teratogen. Making a human is tricky business, and certain things have to happen precisely at the right time during development, and there's not a lot of room for error. So, a teratogenic chemical might cause no health consequences to the mother, but they do affect the embryo or fetus. And by the way, you're an embryo up to 8 weeks, and then a fetus for the next 7. Teratogens differ in their effects depending on the age of the embryo or fetus. The closer you are to being born, the less critical things are going on, and you're basically just growing in size. But when you're a very young embryo, cells are dividing and deciding that which cells are going to be your legs and which ones are going to be your arms, and cellular errors that early in development have serious consequences to how different parts of you may develop. Now, I'm not going to go over them here, but you should be able to go read a bit in your book about the effects of PCBs and mercury. Both are teratogens, so be sure to read those and know some about how they affect living things and how they've come to be chemical risks that we face in the environment. And now these toxic chemicals, besides the broad classes of carcinogenic, mutagenic, and teratogenic, they can have other effects on the human body that don't quite fit the 3 big classes of chemicals. The first up is that they can have effects on the immune system. This picture's of a macrophage, which are basically white blood cells that attack and engulf foreign invaders in your body. In this case, it's a worm. And while one macrophage can't take out the whole worm, the 50 or so that are here are going to ruin this worm's whole day. Toxic chemicals can sometimes damage the cells of the immune system and weaken it, leaving the body vulnerable to attack by pathogens like bacteria, viruses, protists, and fungi. Now, neurotoxins are chemicals that affect the nervous system, which includes the brain, spinal cord, and all of the nerves that coordinate your body. The damage that causes ranges from temporary to long term, and that all depends on which kind of chemical and how much a person is exposed to and for how long. And last up is toxic chemicals that affect the endocrine system. If the nervous system is responsible for organizing your body's short-term coordination in response to the environment through the use of nerves, the endocrine system works to do the same thing, but on longer timescales through the use of hormones. Different glands in your body release hormones to trigger or suppress certain activities in specific cells, and those cells that can respond to the hormone have receptors on the outside that can bind with the hormone. It's called the lock and key model, where the hormone is a key that can unlock a cell and cause it to do something or stop doing something. In this case, the toxic chemical mimics the hormone and can bind with receptors even though it isn't the actual hormone. It fools the cell. And that's a problem, because then the cell starts doing whatever the hormone would have asked it to do instead. But that isn't the proper reaction for that moment in time. Many chemicals in the environment are estrogen mimics, meaning they bind to estrogen receptors and cause responses associated with estrogen. Anti-androgen chemicals bind to an anti-androgen receptors and don't fully activate them, but they block the real androgen hormone from binding. Now, an example of androgen is testosterone. Both classes of chemicals are called gender benders because it doesn't matter about your genetic gender. If you're male and exposed to excess levels of estrogen or estrogen-like chemicals, or you're male and your natural testosterone is blocked from working, interesting things happen to the physical appearance of a gender. So, in summary, there's a lot of bad stuff out there, and it can cause all sorts of problems. But the conveniences of modern life mean that some of these things are necessary. But it's a matter of determining how to use them in a way that reduces risk and still allows us to enjoy life in a style in which we've become accustomed. For chemical hazards, the study of harmful effects caused by chemicals is called toxicology. It centers around the idea of toxicity, or how harmful a substance is. Now, the reality is that every substance on Earth is toxic, but the amount that it takes to reach toxic levels varies depending on the substance. Even something as benign as water can be toxic if ingested in large enough quantities. There was a real-life example of this in 2007 when a radio show sponsored a Hold Your Wee for a Wee contest, where contestants drank bottle after bottle of water, and the winner was whoever could hold it the longest without going to the bathroom. The article pointed out that the woman who died consumed about 2 gallons of water in 2 hours. Now, it's recommended to drink about 64 fluid ounces of water or other fluids, including from foods that are mostly water, and 2 gallons is 4 times that amount. That's a lot of water. If she had consumed that amount of water over a longer period of time, her body could have gotten rid of most of it. But she overwhelmed the system, and her body functions started to shut down in response to overloading the system. So, we could say that her dose of water was too high that caused her to die. Dose is the amount of a harmful chemical that has been ingested, inhaled, or absorbed through the skin. The problem comes when trying to figure out the toxicity of various doses, because there are a lot of variables that affect it. It can be affected by a person's age, their overall health condition, or other personal habits that may affect the toxicity of a second chemical. In addition, it can be affected by a person's genetic makeup, whether liver and kidneys can work to remove toxins from the body. There are several other factors here that can affect toxicity, so it's worth reading the book to make sure that you get them all. Now, the response is the effect that results from the exposure to a chemical. Effects can range from acute effects, which are short-term, and often reversible, to chronic effects, which are longer-term, or can be permanent. In figuring out how toxic a chemical is, researchers test the chemical at varying doses, and then figure out how many test organisms die. For this picture, if 4 units of a chemical are given, then a very small percentage of the test organisms die. If 12 units are given, nearly all of the organisms die. But there's a point for every toxic chemical where 50% of the test organisms die, and that's called the LD50, which stands for lethal dose, 50%. It's a standard point of reference for a chemical. Now, the level of exposure that is allowed for that chemical needs to be much, much lower than the LD50 amount. But it's a point to start from to work out what is a safe level of exposure. Obviously, these things are tested on animals like mice and monkeys, which stand in for humans, because nobody's going to volunteer for an LD50 trial to determine toxicity of a new chemical. An LD50 is a common question on your AP test, which brings in a lot of problems with the LD50, because testing on animals isn't the most popular thing, and it's also expensive. So, there are alternative ways to measure toxicity, like testing the effects of chemicals on human cell growth and culture. That makes it faster, cheaper, and much less controversial because there are no cute little mice or bunnies dying in the process. There are other ways also, like relying on medical records. By looking at different individuals' medical records, researchers can put together the pieces of a puzzle to figure out that certain chemicals or exposures may have had an effect. By looking for similarities and differences between various groups of people, it can become clear that one group of people is suffering from toxic chemicals due to their workplace, where they live, or simply genetic similarities that make them more susceptible to the chemical. Now, all of this comes back to the fact that we have a lifestyle to support, but we need to achieve that lifestyle while minimizing the risk we face in the process of getting there. The pollution prevention principle states that if we know something is hazardous, we should work to reduce the risk by reducing people's exposure to the chemical or by finding less harmful substitutes. Leaded gas is a great example because, as it became apparent that lead was a serious environmental problem, lead was removed from gasoline, and less toxic anti-knock compounds like ethanol were blended in as a replacement. In addition, car manufacturers modified their engine design so they wouldn't need the lubrication provided by the lead, and, in the end, less lead is released in the environment. So, pollution has been prevented. It's actually a major environmental success story. To this day, you can still buy bottles of lead substitute that you add to the unleaded gas for older cars with engines that still need leaded gas. So, everyone still has their lifestyle, but nobody is brain damaged from lead exposure. And we have actually reduced lead health effects by over 90%. Now, the precautionary principle takes a slightly different angle on the problem of toxic chemicals, and it states that when something is unclear as to how toxic it may be, it's best to assume that it is a toxic until proven otherwise. In other words, the substance is guilty until proven to be innocent. That's a very forward-thinking idea, because some of the effects of toxic substances are irreversible, so it's best to act to prevent them entirely. Last up is the idea of risk analysis. Risk analysis covers the risk assessment and risk management ideas from the beginning of the chapter, along with communicating the information about risk to educate people about them. This table is a result of risk analysis, and it highlights the top risks that humans face. Looking at this graphic sorted by numbers of deaths per year, the biggest risks we face include poverty, malnutrition, and dying of preventable diseases. It's estimated that 11 million people die every year from these. That's over 30,000 per day. What's also alarming is number 2 is now air pollution. The number in red to the right is how many fully loaded 200-passenger jets it would take per day if it were to crash and kill everyone on board. Tobacco is 3, and the flu and pneumonia falls in as number 4. Some of the other ones down the line are surprising, like diarrhea, tuberculosis, and several other diseases that aren't that common in this country. Remember, this is a ranking of worldwide risk and death toll. So remember that living in this country is really just a great place to be. When you go to college, every one of you will be tested for tuberculosis, not because it's very likely that any of you actually have it, but because even one person picking it up on a mission trip to a third world country can lead to its reestablishment on a college campus, and that doesn't help recruiting much. The graph to the right shows how many people lack what we here in the United States would call basic necessary needs. This graph represents those in poverty and shows why it is one of the leading causes of death worldwide. Number 1 is that on this list is adequate sanitation facilities. The percent of the total population is to the right. Down near the bottom of this list is clean drinking water, but it still represents 880 million people, and we have the technology to prevent this issue. However, it does cost money. I hope it puts in perspective how fortunate we are to be living in the United States. Clean drinking water and sanitation facilities are not something we ever really think about. You can also take note of fuel for cooking and heating, electricity, and adequate health care could also have a huge impact on total death rate. This graph represents the leading causes of death in the U.S. Tobacco use is still high, followed by auto accidents. As you can see, our death rates are much different than those in less developed countries. And there's a reason we tend to overestimate our risk to unlikely events and underestimate things that are actually quite risky. There's actually 5. The first one is fear. We tend to fear things that seem dangerous, and we overestimate the risk of those things. People, by and large, fear newer technologies that actually may be safer than older ones. Regardless, fear leads us to give our estimates of risk wrong. A big one is flying. It is actually much safer to fly than it is to drive. However, I know many people who refuse to fly because of the risk they perceive it to be. Second, it matters how much control we have. How much more comfortable driving my car than putting my life in the hands of a commercial airline pilot, even though statistically I'm much more likely to have an accident while driving than while flying. It just matters that I'm not in complete control of the flying part. So that makes me think it's riskier than it really is. And because the media only shows you the one crash where obviously everyone probably didn't do real well. And that sticks in our head. It doesn't go over the thousands and thousands of flights every single day that land safely. Third, we're frightened because of catastrophic risk. Even though it's very unlikely to ever occur, the after effects of 9/11 are still quite present in airports to this day, even though the likelihood of it ever happening again is very, very slim. Fourth, optimism bias makes us terrible at estimating risk because each person thinks they're better than average, whether it's driving, reaching off the end of a ladder, etc. It's the idea that, yes, there's a risk, but it's not going to happen to me, so I don't need to worry about it. Teenagers are really bad at this. You can be better than average at some things, but by definition, we can't all be better than average in regard to risk. And last, if something offers instant gratification, we tend to underestimate the risk. There's some powerful psychology at work. With hormones and everything, that happens when you receive instant gratification, but the potential harm comes way later in the game. I love going to concerts and hearing music up close, so loud that you can actually feel it resonating in you. Actually, I used to love it. It's bothersome now. I'm old. There's gratification in that, and it's hard to explain, but it's fun. 99% of people at concerts don't wear any hearing protection, and over a lifetime of exposure to those loud sounds, you'll lose significant parts of your ability to hear. So, if you are going to go to concerts, I remind you to try to wear earplugs, just to protect that hearing from long-term risks, because it's not okay to just say, but just this one time. If you think it's silly, I'll bet you that if you try it, you'll actually find that you can hear the music better. Because once sound goes past a certain amplitude, your ear can't hear it because it's simply too loud. You can also hear what people are saying without them having to lean into your ear and shout, which is very interesting because you would think it's the opposite. However, I guarantee you at the age of 60, you would much rather go back wear those earplugs at your concert as opposed to having to wear hearing aids the rest of your life. And that's going to be it for this screencast. Thanks for watching.